to the Scaling Japan podcast, a podcast about how to grow your business from $100,000 and beyond in the land of the rising sun.
Welcome to the Scaling Japan podcast. I'm your host, Tyson Batino, and on today's episode, we have Fuminori Gunji. Fuminori is the Global Alliance Manager at Deel Inc, and he has more than 10 years of experience in new business development in Japan, in both startups and large corporations like SoftBank. Not only that, he has served as both the CEO and COO in previous roles and led a company to a successful M&A. He really enjoys taking companies from stages 0 to 1 and 1 to 5, and he is going to share his tips with us on how to improve our sales in Japan. So Fuminori, could you please give a short introduction, please?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Tyson. Been listening to some of your episodes, and it's really good stuff that you're putting out here. So very honored to be here. So short introduction. I'm Japanese. I was born in Tokyo, but somehow I ended up growing up in Germany, spending my first 20 years basically in German until high school graduation. Then I went on to study in Netherlands because I was sick of Germany, wanted to get out. And then I wanted to just live my happy life in Europe because I like living in Europe very much. But approaching my mid-20s, close to graduation, I noticed, okay, I kind of want to live in Japan to be able to say I'm fully Japanese and not just, a banana who looks Asian on the outside but is white on the inside. But the plan was to come back to Europe after 3 or 5 years and just basically brush up my CV. But then I came to Tokyo and I had a lot of negative expectations about the Japanese society. Many of them which proved to be true, but so there were no negative surprises, but it gave me room to sort of pay attention to the positive surprises. And I liked living and working in Tokyo very much. And now it's been 15 years almost working and living in Tokyo. And as was introduced, mostly in the intersection of new business development, software IT, and B2B.
Awesome. Now, I'm really glad to have you on the podcast. I actually discovered you on your appearances on several other podcasts on the topic of sales and customer experience. And so because Fuminori has pumped out so much good content or appeared on other podcasts and talked about various topics, we're going to put it in his other appearances in the show notes as well. And so I'm very excited for today. And this is a topic that a lot of people have been bugging me to start. And so sales in Japan. So probably the first question that comes up is, I guess, so why do so many foreign companies struggle with doing sales in Japan?
I think one of the things is that the decision-making process in Japanese companies is different than in most Western countries. And I think when you say, why do so many foreign companies struggle, I think it's in brackets Western companies, because I think it's common in Asia in general, this kind of struggle. And what I mean by the difference is that in Japan, even when the title of a key person that you talk to suggests that they have control over the budget and that they have a decision-making power as an individual, it's not true. Like the organization matrix doesn't necessarily reflect the sort of budget or sort of the decision-making power of any person. Regardless of the actual position in a Japanese company, making is very collective. And collective does not only go in terms of they have to check with their bosses and the bosses' bosses, but also it goes like downwards. So they have to check also with the subordinates and their peers. I think what many people might not realize is that the Japanese manager, even though it seems like this very sort of, let's say, male dominant and hierarchical organization, the truth is that even the bosses have to check with the subordinates. And if they don't have the support of the subordinates, then they can't really make a good decision. And everybody knows that in a way. So basically, when you try to close a deal, it's not enough to just convince the person who is in the meeting room or convince the person who seems to have the decision-making power on paper, but you have to involve his or her stakeholders as well and sort of help that key person convince those stakeholders. And so that's why sales in Japan tends to take a little bit longer. However, because it is a collective decision-making, Japanese customers in the B2B realm, at least, they tend to be loyal in terms of they tend to stick with you longer unless you do something like totally unacceptable. So if the customer service is appropriate and the product is good enough, let's say, then the customers don't easily cancel on you. So it takes longer, but then the churn rate is also lower, I think.
Gotcha. And the company I founded previously, I founded with two Japanese men, and I was only non-Japanese co-founder. It took me a while to really wrap my head around the concept of collective decisions as well. And in some cases, it was like, why are you asking me? But it's like, feel free to make the decision. I trust you.
Right.
I trust you, so don't worry about it. I realize in terms of, I'll use the term organization instead of company.
Yeah.
But when you have an organization, you have different departments, you want people moving together in the same direction. After you made the decision, you don't want people to start creating chaos or division by saying like, actually, no, I don't think we should partner with that company, or like, actually, we should avoid this. I also like, after I started to realize that, I was like, okay, I can actually kind of see the benefits of the collective decision from an execution standpoint as an organization.
No, exactly. So I was recently chatting with one of my former colleagues who used to be the CTO of one of the companies that I worked with, and we're still having beer together now and then. And we really talked about exactly that same topic, that even though it may seem like it takes longer in Japan, I think the COVID response was a good example. It seemed to take very long for the Japanese government to respond in terms of vaccination and whatnot. But because it's a collective decision making, once it starts rolling out, it goes really fast. And Japan took over many countries in terms of vaccination rate. I think that's a really good example of how things work in Japan. Like the upfront planning and coordination and collective decision making, of course, takes much longer. But once you get to the execution phase, it's really fast because everyone pulls along and everybody's already in agreement, or at least they stated the agreement in the meeting, and so they're responsible to sort of execute accordingly, even though they might not personally maybe agree with it. But that's like the so-called nemawashi thing that's happening before anything is done. Yeah, so exactly, that's the thing. And I think one of the reasons where this collective decision making comes from is, this is maybe a little bit sort of off theory, but I think it has a lot to do with the agricultural history. So in many Asian countries, not just Japan, making rice basically is the primary way to make food for yourself. And basically managing a fields of rice takes a lot of labor in terms of when you plant it, but also when you collect it. And that's different from like hunter-gatherer, or when you can just, hunt some good meat, basically. You don't need that many people. It's just a group of 2, 3, maybe 5, and that's it. But when you're managing your fields of rice, then you need the whole village basically to help you, and you have to also help other people. And so I think this collective decision making comes from that point. Like everybody depends on everyone else, and they understand they are just an extension of everyone else. And if you don't pull along, then you might get expelled, or you don't get your share of rice, for example. I think that's where it comes from, and that's one aspect. The other aspect is the Japanese education system, I think. That sort of goes into the organization culture, especially bigger Japanese companies as well, is that you don't advance in your career by taking risks and delivering great results, not necessarily. There are some of those as well. They are the ones who end up CEO, but that's a rare exception. Most of the people who sort of climb up the ladder in a Japanese organization are people who never made a mistake. So they have a clean sheet. And having a clean sheet is, for many people, more important than taking risk and delivering great results. And hence, the way you basically maintain a clean sheet is whenever you take a decision, or when you're positioned to make a buying decision, for example, you make sure that you're not the only one who made that decision, because once that, let's say that the software you bought isn't turning out to be great, then you can basically point fingers to everyone else and say, well, we made this decision all together, so it's not just my fault, it's everyone else's fault. And then if it's everyone else's fault, it's nobody's fault. And so there's the sense of like risk aversion and sort of hedging your risks of that's what's behind the collective decision making as well.
Oh, that was very insightful. So yeah, it's not only from an execution standpoint, but also as someone in an organization who would like to climb up the ladder.
Yeah. Right.
This is the way, let's say, you de-risk your decisions.
Right.
So yeah, thanks for sharing that background. And other than, let's say, decision-making styles, or also ways to de-risk decision-making in Japan, what are some other differences in common sense from a Western and Japanese standpoint?
I think other things are, I'm noticing, especially right now that I'm working sort of again for a more like global company, is that English proficiency in Japan is very, very low, unfortunately, for a company of this level of GDPs, let's say. And even among APAC countries, that's also something that maybe many foreign companies don't realize. And so let's say you have product and the material you have, the marketing material, the customer support material, all that stuff is usually in English, right? Because that's the global language. And in many countries, in the initial phase, that's good enough. At least for those customers who are, let's say, in the market segmentation, who are innovators and early adopters, they are fine with working with like non-local language because they're so much interested in getting their hands on the product. And that works for countries like Singapore as well, who's just people in the managerial level, they speak English and they understand, and it's fine. And in Japan, that's not the case. So you need to localize everything that customers will get to see into Japanese. Another point is then that it's not just enough to sort of translate one-on-one the material, but the tone has to change as well. So you kind of have to redo the whole material that gets shown to customers, whether it's from marketing or customer support or sales material as well. So that takes a lot of time, and you need people who understand Japanese sales culture to develop those materials to hit the right tone. And so I think that's something that's very often underestimated. It's not just the language, it goes much deeper than that. Yeah, I think that's another key point here that usually tends to translate to taking longer time, because it's not just the initial phase, but every time you launch a new feature, a new product, you have to do the whole process again. But again, it's still worth it because it still is a huge market. Once the sales is done and the deal is closed, companies tend to stick with you longer than in other countries. So, yeah.
A lot of companies are struggling with the challenge of doing sales in Japan. I think that first angle is there are the big cultural differences, but also not only the general cultural differences. It's if you're a small business selling to a corporation, there's that cultural difference. You're a corporation to corporation, there's a difference. And I would say the position you're selling to, there's a difference. And there's all these layers and layers of differences in sales technique with the added layer of cultural complexity in Japan.
Yeah, the cultural complexity, to break it down a little bit further, is there is this notion of the customer. In English, you have the saying, the customer's king, right? In Japanese, there's the saying, the customer's God, meaning if the delta between the company size of the selling party and the buying party, the bigger it is, the more the buying party feels entitled and compelled to make sort of custom requests, let's say. And most of the time in Japanese companies, the smaller companies tend to go along with it and basically try to please the customer just to make the sale, which, in previous times, maybe with different kinds of product, it was a way to do it. But when you're dealing with SaaS products, for example, that of course doesn't work, because SaaS is about having a unified product for everyone available. And then you just pick whatever feature set or whatever you want, but it's the same. Everybody still gets the same product in a way. And so the way I used to explain things to Japanese customers when I was sort of trying to sell SaaS to SMBs and bigger companies was, I always make an analogy as there's a difference between tailor-made suits, and then you can also buy suits at Uniqlo. And what we're doing is Uniqlo. You can pick size S, M, and L. It might not fit you perfectly, but it gets the job done. And it's way, way cheaper than buying a tailored suit. So, and you don't have any initial cost, and you get, and the size SML, the features, basically they keep on improving and getting better. And you don't have to pay any of that. It's all baked into the monthly price, basically. And some people then understand, I'll sort of pull my custom request and sort of try to work with that one. But then the challenge then becomes that you have to be very good in expectation management to these customers in terms of what future functions or features will be added to your product in whatever time frame, which then easily can get you in conflict with a product team, of course. So you have to be very conservative in making sort of the sort of estimates of when the product team says, okay, we'll probably be able to launch this feature in 6 months, better tell your customer it will be a year, that kind of stuff. So you have to be really good in expectation management.
Like what you're listening to and ready to scale your company? Let Tyson coach you and your team to make the jump. You can find more information about our coaching and advisory services at www.scalingyourcompany.com. Now, back to our podcast.
I think that expectation management is a very important point. And I want to clarify, what is SML before I move
Oh,
into my
I meant
clarification.
SMB. SML. Oh,
Ah,
SML was so the size you buy for T-shirts in Uniqlo, right? Is SML or XL or whatever. That's what I meant. And so similar, when I make this metaphor of how it's like to sell SaaS in Japan, I tend to tell customers to educate them in a way to say, okay, you can go to Accenture or whatever and get your tailored suit, which is extremely expensive, not just the initial cost, but also the yearly maintenance fee. Or you can come to us and just like at Uniqlo, you get a T-shirt, that's what you want. And you have to pick the size S, M, or small, medium, or
I got
large.
you. Yeah. And just the level of services
Yeah,
difference.
exactly. Pick your price plan, basically, that suits you the best in terms of the limited options you have.
And for the
Yeah.
expectation management, yeah, sorry for interrupting. It's
No.
I think this is one of the key points I see a lot of companies struggle with. And sometimes they even hire a Japanese salesperson who is very bad at expectations management. And they end up not selling everything because, let's say, the person who is doing the sales, they'll be kind of like, it'll come in 6 months, it'll come in 1 year, and the client's like, awesome, we'll purchase
Yeah.
in 6 months.
Yeah.
We'll purchase in 1 year.
Yeah.
Or like they might come to the product team and say like, we need all these features, and the product team is like, okay, how are they going to use it for? I
Yeah.
don't know, they just said they need it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so sometimes, because they assume the customer is God, they also assume that they know the customer knows exactly what they need. And
Yeah.
oftentimes with a startup, if you're selling something innovative,
Yeah.
they might not actually know what they need. And so
Yeah.
that expectation management. So sorry for harping on everyone, but I
No.
think this,
It's absolutely true. I agree with you.
it's a make or break your company topic.
Yeah. It's true. And what many salespeople in Japan are not good at, the mass of them, let's say. I mean, of course, they're brilliant salespeople in Japan, but the mass of salespeople, the sales culture in Japan, let's put it that way, is very army style. It's not Navy, I'm talking army. So like foot soldiers, and it may be the case in many countries, but especially in Japan, it's the effort and trying to please the customer is sort of the mantra. It's not so much about vision selling or trying to sort of make the customer understand what this concept is about, and that doesn't usually happen. So that's why you end up with the example that you mentioned before, like, okay, they come up with all these requests from the customer, not necessarily knowing what it's for, but assuming that's what they really need. And so that makes it a little bit hard to find a good salesperson in Japan. And I've been, also doing a lot of recruitment in Japan for startups. Finding a good salesperson is probably one of the most difficult recruitment tasks you can have in Japan. Like you can hire someone, but it's really hard to find a good one.
What is a good salesperson in Japan? Or what is the
Yeah.
characteristics of a good salesperson?
The basics, I think, are the same for any country. Like, they have to be good in managing their own KPI. They have to be good in having a thick skin, basically, and being able to handle a lot of rejections, because that's what happens at the initial sales phase. But the other thing is whether they can tell a good story. It doesn't have to be a story about an actual product that they handle. Giving them sort of interview questions like, tell me sort of some interesting story of that you learned about, whatever, or basically what is something that you find very interesting, but not many people necessarily agree that it's an interesting field or topic or domain, and tell me that story and kind of try to make me get interested into that one. And so what you look for is basically, is this a good storyteller? Because storytelling is eventually the thing that you need to do in order to do so-called vision selling. You kind of tell the story, this is whatever process you're doing right now, how this is going to look like in 5-10 years. And you can start now and get ready for the future, or you can stick to your old ways, but then, in 5-10 years, things will really break down. And you cannot cover this with manpower anymore, because look at the development in the labor market, it's shrinking. Right, the labor force is shrinking. So you have to figure out ways to do this with less people. And this is the product to do it. By getting a foothold, basically, or getting started early, you'll be prepared for the future that's obviously coming. So can they tell a story that starts out with like very macro stuff that nobody can deny, like big developments that nobody can deny that will happen in 5 to 10 years. And then from there, sort of distilling it to that's why you need to buy this product right now. So are they able to tell that kind of story? And then do they have this understanding and awareness of macroeconomic developments? Like, do they read the Nikkei newspaper like properly in the sense of not just following the news, but really understanding it from a historical perspective as well? People who can tell a story based on these sort of macroeconomic trends, they usually tend to do well. And those who are just good in having this like typical, let's say, sales mentality in terms of like, crashing the numbers, they might do well in the short run, but not in the mid to long run. And so you want to look for those who can tell a story. That's, I would say, is the key point.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense from the macroeconomic point of view. Not only they have, I guess, it's a product or service knowledge, but they also have industry knowledge, so it makes them sound like an authority.
Yeah. It's more about the skill of, can you look at the bigger picture that's beyond the industry and sort of maybe you just read about those patterns, that's fine too, from experts, but basically referring to macro trends in the economy in general, not just the specific industry. And then from there, distilling it down to, obviously, this product is the future. Would you want to be part of the future instead of the past? Kind of that storytelling.
Thanks for clarifying that.
Mm.
Also, you mentioned about storytelling. I'm curious, are there any differences in storytelling between like a Japanese style versus like a Western style of story?
I don't think so. Not in terms of sales, I would say. Yeah, no, I think that's actually still the same. I think the key point, not just in Western or Japanese storytelling, where I don't think there's much of a big difference, is the reason why you start out with these macroeconomic trends that nobody can deny, because it's too obvious, at least in the longer term. The point is that you want to get to a collection of yes from the customer. Basically, you start out with a macroeconomic trend that nobody can deny, because nobody can deny it because it's too obvious. It's written in the Nikkei newspaper, for example. They will start with yes to saying what you say, and you get the first yes. And then you want to get to the next yes. So inferring from there, you say, so hence, this is going to happen probably in your industry, correct? And then you say yes. You want to get to like 2 or 3 yeses until you actually introduce your product, because around that time, they kind of get used to saying yes to what you're saying. And then basically the conclusion is, well, if you're saying yes to those 3, then you should say yes to this product. Of course, it's not bulletproof. It depends a lot on delivery as well. But the logical scheme to use is, how do I get to 2 or 3 yeses before I actually talk about my product? And I think a good salesperson can do that. But another thing is that, because you have to adjust your story a little bit every time you talk to a customer, because the customer may not be necessarily aware of all these macroeconomic trends and the story that you have in mind. So you have to tell those stories in a way that resonates with them. In order to do that, you need to do a lot of listening to their problems and sort of adjust your story and maybe pick up some keywords from their story to bake that into your story, and then sort of deliver it. So in Japan, they say a good salesperson is 80% listening and 20% talking. I think the point is, before you actually pitch your product, it's really important to listen to what the customers are saying, even when they mention a lot of things that are not directly related to your product or that your product cannot solve. It's good to have that awareness and adjust your story accordingly. And then when you get to the point of when they're showing initial interest, and then it's about, okay, how do I get your stakeholders interested and on the same page here? Then again, the story that you listen to of the customer is very important, because okay, your stakeholders are probably having these problems. So how do we address that problem? Because whenever you introduce a new product, a new solution, what it means is you're introducing a new way of doing things in a new system. And in Japan, when you say system, people think about IT right away. But of course, in Western culture, we know system is it's not just about IT. It's like any organized form of doing things and a sort of a logical framework of doing things. And so you have to understand, whenever you change one piece of the value chain in their company, it will affect some of their stakeholders, like in upstream of the value chain or downstream of the value chain. And so you have to be aware of that and then say, okay, how can we work to the people who are most affected by your change? How can we convince them that it's still a good idea to introduce this product, so that you won't have the pushback from other departments in introducing this new product into the system? And so you have to be aware of that, and then figure out, okay, how can I help you to convince your stakeholders that the change that you're going to make is either not going to affect them or is going to help them as well and going to reduce the work they do in terms of other departments. That's the importance of like listening to your customer. And if you don't listen to it, then that's how you end up taking all the feature requests at face value and think, that's necessary. But when you listen to their story and then they come up with a feature request, then you can actually say, actually, you won't need that feature and that feature and that feature because, we can work around that by doing this or that, right? And it doesn't have to be a change on the product side. It's just a different way of data integration, for example, system integration, which usually is, I think, comes up very often in enterprise solutions. Speaking of that one, segue a little bit. So in Japan, they have, in a way, very high expectations to systems, even though they're doing a lot of manual work. What I mean by that is they want to go from 0 to 100, like right away. And they say, okay, if we want to introduce a system, that everything should be automated. That's also an aspect that needs some education by saying, well, why don't we just start out with this piece here? And once we really figure this out and you get used to this one, then we can tackle the next one and the next one, and not just trying to do everything all at once. That's a typical customer request that they say, okay, if we're going to introduce the system, everything has to be automated. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense, which is not true. But you kind of have to convince them that why don't we first do this one, and this will deliver results in terms of cost or time or whatever reduction or even revenue increase here, and then sort of try to build along the line and maybe start out with a manual integration, a data integration, a CSV export or whatever import, that type of stuff, and then gradually work towards like more automated processes. That's sort of also education that needs to happen when you do sales.
Yeah, and it ties in what you mentioned earlier about people who climb the corporate ladder are people who don't make mistakes. And if they were to do full automation and it goes wrong, they're essentially off, let's say, the career path.
Yeah, no, that's actually a really good point. So baking in basically, if you go for full automation, it will cost more and it's a higher risk for you. It's probably a good way to kind of scare them away from going like from 0 to 100 right away, but starting small. By starting small, you kind of make your product more sellable. I think those are basically lowering the stakes, making them aware of the risk the more they request, and being aware of the fact that they need to convince internally their stakeholders as well. And sometimes you need to go the extra mile of, okay, how can I create material for your internal discussions? So basically, like sometimes in like bigger enterprise stuff, I won't do it for every SMB stuff, but for big enterprise, I would say, okay, can you give me the format of your PowerPoint slide? And I will create the slides for you that you need to do in order to give the presentation in a, for example, internal, weekly, monthly, whatever meeting to bring that up, to ask for budget or get approval from other departments, whatever. That's how far you sometimes have to go to basically help them with the Nemawashi process internally.
I agree 100%. And one thing I always tell my clients is, your product, your service. This is all what you eat, breathe every day. But your client, they probably have, let's say, 5 different priorities. They're dealing with 15 to 20 people. The more you can reduce their burden, the more time they'll have to actually practice the slides that you make for them. So rather than getting them to kind of figure out what to present, just let them focus on the presentation itself.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. I'm so glad you mentioned that. And actually, just to clarify, so I guess the question of hiring a good salesperson, did you have any other tips on maybe how to, let's say, weed out or maybe like kind of tests you could give them to help people find the right person?
Yeah, so one was the one I mentioned before was storytelling. Are they good storytellers in a logical way, but also like, appealing way?
I think there's the macro one as well. It was, I think, having thick skin because you're going to get rejected a lot.
Right. Thick skin is kind of hard to test, to be honest, but a good adjacent thing to thick skin, which is easier to test for in an interview setting, is whether they have humor. I think it goes without saying, humor goes a really long way in making people listen to you, but also, especially like self-deprecating humor, it shows a certain level of humility and being humble to some extent. If someone can make a joke about themselves, then it's not necessarily equal to thick skin, but it shows they can handle maybe rejections in a better way by laughing about it after a while, or right away. And that's also a good sign of like thick skin. It's also a sign of people who are coachable, I think, also show good signs of humor, because the hardest thing you have when you hire a salesperson who are not coachable is they think this is the way to do sales. I know it because I've done it like all the way, like for many years, and you have to change your product or you have to change whatever. Otherwise it can't be sold, right? Sometimes you have those people. In a way it's lacking humor, but it's like there's a certain stubbornness, and you don't want people who are too stubborn in their approach. The goal, they should be stubborn about the goal, but not about the approach, not about the how, right? Looking out for humor is a good way to see like whether they are coachable and whether they can sort of, take a hit and still keep on marching basically with a smile on their face. So that's also something I tend to look for. Do they have humor, self-deprecating humor especially?
Awesome. So back to the topic of hiring a salesperson.
Mhm.
Are there any types of tests that you do to see
Yeah.
whether they're suitable for the position or not?
What we usually do is give them a really short description of the product. Usually, if they're coming for an interview, they kind of checked out your website before. If they didn't, it's also a good sign of that they're not a great salesperson because they didn't prepare very well. Because interview for them, especially for salesperson, is basically a sales pitch meeting. So basically, I ask, hey, did you check out our product? Okay, great. But then still give them a sort of brief summary of what this product is about or can do in terms of just the descriptive way of like what it does, not the pitch. It's just the description of features. Nowadays, maybe not that relevant, but back then we used to do like a role play of a sales call. So let's say, okay, it's a cold call. You call me, you're the salesperson, I'm a customer, and give me the pitch that will get you the appointment for a meeting. And it would give them like 5 or 10 minutes to work on sort of the script of the call that they want to do. I would give like fairly realistic responses of the customer, usually in a negative way, like, yeah, I don't have time, or we don't have budget for this year, like the typical like no answers, right? Without saying no in Japan, of course, because in Japan they rarely say no, I'm not interested. It's just like I just don't have time, or well, we already made the budget for this year, etc., etc. And then see what kind of counter pitch they come up with. That's one test. And another one that wasn't really intended from our side, but that was just a great salesperson. The person in the very first meeting, he came up with his own sales deck for our product right away. That I found was pretty cool, and it was really well done. And yeah, he proved to be great. That just shows like in multiple ways. Like first of all, he was prepared. He did look up the product very much. And also like competitors, for example, there was a small competitor analysis and basically a sort of comparison matrix, and of course showing it in a way that our product is the best choice. And so people who can develop their own sales deck in a great way, it's also part of the storytelling that I mentioned before. Like it was that storytelling was in the deck, but it usually takes a bit more time, of course, like at least 1 or 2 hours, I would say, even if you're fast. One thing you could do is in advance, before the sales meeting or before the interview, you could say like, hey, take a look at our website and come up with your own sales deck. That could be one thing you could do. But yeah, the role play and doing a cold call sales call and actually have them customize the self-made pitch deck is sales deck is probably a good way to test them in terms of skill.
Yeah, if they can create a sales deck, I think it goes back to what you mentioned, like they know how to tell a story.
Yeah.
And they know the flow of the conversation if it goes well. And
Right.
I've seen a lot of bad salespeople or they're overconfident in their ability to adjust in the moment, or they feel like they're interpersonal masters. I don't need to prepare. I'll just adjust to the situation. And it often comes off as unprofessional.
I agree.
Awesome.
I agree.
I definitely would like to go for a round 2.
Thank you.
I definitely want to go like the kind of coming with the sales strategy and also the gatekeeper.
Yeah, in round 2, we could definitely touch more upon sales strategy, because no matter how good your pitch is and how you are in the meeting or how you follow up on a meeting, the most important thing, even before that, is actually the targeting strategy. Like which customers do you approach in the first place, which is sales strategy to some extent. there's a whole bunch to tell, I think, regarding targeting as well. I see a lot of mistakes when it comes to targeting, especially like foreign companies entering Japan. So yeah.
It was great having you on the podcast, Fuminori.
Thank you for having me. It was great fun talking to you.
And we definitely need to go for round 2.
Yeah, let's do it.